informal type meetings, and they were an advisory role. But who did the final decision come from? President. So if I'm an advisor to Mr. Smith as guidance counselor, he asks me for advice on things he does, and he asks me for a little more advice because I served as principal. I've known him for 30 years, and he'll come in to me at times and say, hey, I need your advice. I'm thinking about doing this. What do you think? And I'll say, yeah, I think that's a pretty good idea. Or I'll say, oh, geez, I think that's stupid. Whose decision is it whether he does it or not? His. Okay, and sometimes he takes my advice and I'm right and he's right. And sometimes he doesn't take my advice and I'm wrong and he was right. Sometimes he takes my advice and I was right and he was wrong. I mean, you see how it goes. Okay, but the ultimate person that the anvil is going to fall on is the president, because he makes the final decision. Now, the president's cabinet would also have another name. It would be called the Executive Department. Executive Department. Now, they added another department at the start of Washington's presidency. And it was the Department of, and somebody said it over here, Justice. Okay? So we had the Department of the Treasury, the Department of War, the Department of State, and they began to think a little bit more after that initial creation of those three departments and said, we need a Justice Department. So they have the Department of Justice. And that was started Washington's cabinet. So the President's cabinet would be referred to as the Executive Department and would consist of 4 members. Early in his presidency, that number would rise to 15 before he was done. So he's going to have 15 cabinet members before he leaves office. Started with 4, we'll end up with 15. Now, we haven't told you who his secretaries are in these 4 major cabinet positions, but I'm going to do that now. Anybody know who Washington's first, I'll tell you, Paige, you and Jones better know this, who was Washington's first Secretary of State?
Oh no.
Oh no, I've never heard of that person. You didn't mention that? You didn't delve into his cabinet? Take a guess. You know, you could go from, you could totally redeem yourself from I don't know to taking a guess and acting like you knew it the whole time. So who do you think it would be? Somebody we know, and you know, if you slipped onto your ID sheet, you might get an idea. What do you think? Who was his first Secretary of State?
Thomas Jefferson.
Very good! Give her a hand! You should have just said, Mr. Nerd, I'll tell you who that is. And looked on your sheet and said Thomas Jefferson. Instead of saying, no, I don't know, what'd you say?
I said, oh no.
Oh no, yeah, that new Secretary of State we have, oh no. Thomas Jefferson was the first Secretary of State. Kezia, who was the first Secretary of the Treasury?
Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah! Alexander Hamilton, that girl is bright back there. Alexander Hamilton. Brady, who was the first Secretary of War? Where's your sheet?
It's here, but I don't want to turn it over.
Why?
Because then we got one here.
Oh, why don't you turn yours over? His poor Hunter. He might have bad breath. He wants to
No, that's Henry Knox.
Henry Knox, very good. Now, Henry Knox, by the way, was a general in the Revolutionary War on the colonial side, obviously, and so Washington picked him as his Secretary of War. And who was the first Attorney General that worked in the Justice Department? Somebody must have wrote a report about him in here. What is it? Edmund Randolph. He was the Attorney General. So he wasn't called Secretary of Justice, he was called the Attorney General. So you've got Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of War Henry Knox, and Attorney General Edmund Randolph. Now what would the Attorney General's job be? We didn't define the Department of Justice. What do they help the President with? Huh? Matters of what? Law. They're lawyers. So the Justice Department will help the President with matters of law. And the first Attorney General of the United States was Edmund Randolph. He served as Attorney General of Virginia when it was alone, its own colony. He had been a member of Congress during his career and also was the governor of Virginia. Governor of Virginia. So he had a lot of political experience. He was a very good Attorney General, Edmund Randolph. Okay? Now, you got to give Washington credit. He did not pick these individuals because they were yes men. What's a yes man? say yes to anything you want. Didn't we talk about that once before? We got back and talked about, was it King George III? Okay? He didn't pick yes men. He chose men because they were both brilliant in theory and in practice. They were both brilliant in theory and practice. I want you to write that down and explain it to you. Washington chose these men to be in his cabinet because they were brilliant in both theory and practice. Anybody know the difference between theory and practice? Tristan, what do you think theory is? The difference between theory and practice?
They think they're going to be good and they actually do good.
That's pretty close. Anybody got another definition? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it would be like parents, like they can be, like they think about removing a tooth and then they can actually practice like removing a tooth.
Right. Or a parent, in theory, says that you should be in by 10 o'clock at night, every night, so you don't get yourself in trouble. And then if you're good in practice, they make sure you do. They don't let you come in at 1 and say, oh, that's okay. All right? I'll give you an example that drives me nuts. I taught a seminar class at Montana State University, way back, to aspiring administrators, guys that were going to be administrators, and gals that were going to be administrators. And the kids, students, they were older, they liked the seminar because it talked about practice, not theory. Now, what would I be able to offer teaching prospective administrators? What would be the difference between me talking them theory and me talking them practice? Theory is, well, this is what is supposed to happen if you become an administrator. Practice is, this is what happens. When you go to graduate school to be an administrator, you think they talk to you about graduation rate? You think they talk to you about the mad parent that comes to your office because their daughter's not starting on the basketball team? Do you think you get that in theory? No, you don't get that in theory. And so what I would do when I taught the classes, I would give them scenarios of things that happened to me in my career. And they'd have to write down, what would you do if Johnny's parent came in madder than heck because she didn't get a chance to play in the volleyball team, and you know she went to all these summer camps and she's never got a second in the... So that's practice. How would you deal with that? And they would tell me how they thought they should deal with that. And then I would tell them how I dealt with it. Did I always deal with it right? No. And we'd have a discussion on that. The students like that much better than me telling them about, you know, statistics that show which kids are successful, you know, theory versus practice. What's really the guts of it? Well, Washington picked someone that was brilliant in theory, that said, you know what, I want my kids to have good teeth. And in practice, Dr. Jeffries could give his son good teeth. So could Mrs. Page, or Mr. Page, right? But I couldn't. I could tell you, in theory, boy, you kids need to have good teeth. What am I going to do about it? I'm going to send you to Jeffries and Page, or Nelson, or whoever, right? Because I can't do it. So I'd be good in theory, would I be good in practice? No, okay? These people were good in both. He had a very, very good cabinet, okay? All right, that'll take us to our last subtopic of the day, important one. Basic problems of organizing a new federal government. What are the problems that Washington and his cabinet and the Congress are going to have in organizing a new federal government? Okay, they're starting from scratch, right? They have no national government. Everything is state related. Okay, so I'm going to give you 9 problems that these newly elected officials, this would be the president, the vice president, the Congress, and the cabinet, although they're not elected, but they were chosen. These are the problems they're going to have to overcome if they're going to establish a new federal or national government. Are there state laws in our country at this time? Individual, yeah, but what isn't there, number one? No federal laws. So do you think every state has exactly the same law on every single thing at this time? No. So you've got to get all these individual states to agree to national or federal laws. So we have no federal laws. That's the first problem. Now, once you have laws, what do you need to do to enforce the law? Law enforcement officers, and there were no federal law enforcement officers either. Did you have law enforcement officers in the colonies? Each colony, some did, some didn't, some are stronger than others, but there were no federal law enforcement officers. Now, if you're driving around doing something you shouldn't do and you break a law, and you get arrested by a law enforcement officer, what happens to you next? Where do you go next? What? Where do you go? Not before you go to jail. You go to court. Well, there were no court systems. There were no national court systems to make any decisions on any matters of law. So you got no federal laws, you got no one to enforce the federal laws, and you got no court system to deal with anybody that breaks a federal law. So those are three problems they had to deal with. The fourth problem was a big problem. We didn't have any money in this new country. Why? Because that's the fifth problem. We had little money in the United States is the fourth problem. And the fifth problem is, why did we have little money? I'm asking you to tell me. Yeah, we were just owed a huge debt from the Revolutionary War. So we got no federal laws, we got no law enforcement officers, we got no court systems, we got no money in the country, and the nation owed a tremendous debt from the Revolutionary War that had to be paid back. Now, let's talk about this before we get to the sixth problem. What do you need to pay off that debt?
Money.
How do you get it? Well, there's number 6. We got no method in place for what? Collecting taxes. Okay, so there's number 6. We owe a large debt from the Revolutionary War. We got to raise some revenue, but we got no method in place for collecting taxes. How did we feel about tax collection in the old days? They felt good about it if our individual state made the rules. But once we were taxed without representation, they were mad. Well, now you've got to find a way to tax 13 different states fairly and make sure they're all represented. That was a problem, so we had no tax system. Well, if you ever do get any money, number 7, where are you going to put it? Because we have no federal treasuries. So if you do come up with a place or a tax system, when you collect all this money, you're going to stick it in your pockets or bury it under, Wall Street in New York City. You've got to have a place to put it, and we had no federal treasury to place any monies that we might get. That's the 7th problem. What might be the 8th problem? It really doesn't have anything with finances, but puts us in a vulnerable position. What? Yeah, our military is absolutely weak after the Revolutionary War. We are so vulnerable for attack at this time. If any country, including Britain, wanted to come back at this point and put it to us, they probably would have taken over. And that's going to kind of happen in the War of 1812, which is not far away. We'll talk about that later. Britain's going to get, not that they want to conquer us, but they want us to pay for what they had done, right? They wanted us to bow to them. And that happens in 1812. But the nation had a very weak military after the Revolutionary War. We were so vulnerable, it was unreal. And we had not developed, which is very important as a new country, and that's a policy to deal with countries outside of America, which is known as a foreign policy. Okay? So, the 9 big problems that these newly elected officials had to overcome and establish a new federal or national government is there were no federal laws, there were no federal law enforcement officers, there was no court system in the national government to make decisions on any of these matters of law, there was very little money, we owed a large debt from the Revolutionary War, there was no method for collecting taxes to raise revenue, there was no federal treasury to place any monies we might raise, we had a horribly weak military after the Revolutionary War, we were incredibly vulnerable to foreign countries, and we had no foreign policy. So that will mean that we'll have to do what? Go to work, which will be our next subtopic tomorrow. Congress goes to work to try to overcome these 9 problems. Very good. All right.